World War One was over. Every country in Europe had suffered. Among the Allies, Great Britain had lost nearly 1 million men. Another million and a half had been wounded, hundreds of thousands so badly that they would never again have a normal life. France had suffered even more. Almost 1.5 million French soldiers had died, with millions more wounded. Russia had lost nearly 2 million men. Italy over 500,000. Among the Central Powers, nearly 2 million German soldiers, over 1 million Austrian men, and 500,000 Turkish and Bulgarian fighters had died. In other words, plenty of people died, okay? Like more, just a lot. It's just insane. The war had shattered much of the countryside. Houses were in ruins, roads had been blown up, coal mines had been destroyed. Now it was time to decide how these countries would recover from the war. In 1919, the leaders of the victorious countries gathered together at the immense glittering palace built by Louis XIV at Versailles, not far from Paris. Here they would try to decide what penalties Germany, Austria, and their allies would have to pay. The three most powerful leaders at the conference were Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, and Giorgio Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister. All three of these men had different ideas about what the peace treaty should do. Of the Allies, France had suffered the most from the war. Clemenceau, the Prime Minister of France, had seen much of his country destroyed. He wanted Germany punished. England too had suffered. The people of England shouted, "Make Germany pay!" at the British Prime Minister whenever he went out in public. But Lloyd George was afraid that if Germany was treated too harshly, its people would turn to communism and make another alliance with Russia. He didn't want the Germans to feel so desperate that they were willing to become a communist country. Great Britain had always been a little bit afraid of Russia. It was huge and well armed, and it always seemed to be getting bigger. Now that Russia was communist, Great Britain was even more worried about it. What if the Communist Party decided to spread communism through force by conquering other countries in Europe? If Germany and Russia allied together, they might make an unbeatable enemy. Woodrow Wilson of the United States had a third set of ideas. He too agreed that Germany should be punished, but he thought the most important job of the meeting in Versailles was to figure out how to keep such a war from happening again. He believed that the countries of the world should join together to work out an agreement that all countries would honor. This agreement, he thought, should have 14 different points, but 3 of the points were the most important. 1. All countries should try to make their armies and their collections of weapons smaller. Number 2. Every nation should be able to govern itself independently. And number 3. Every country should belong to an organization called the League of Nations. The League of Nations would act like the parents of a big argumentative family. If 2 countries argued about something, they wouldn't start a war over it, any more than 2 siblings should settle an argument by fist fighting. Instead, the countries would bring the problem to the League of Nations. The countries in the League would discuss the problem, decide what should be done, and tell the hostile countries to do it. Wilson thought that the League of Nations might stop a world war from ever happening again. When the 3 leaders and representatives of other countries that had fought in World War I all got together at Versailles, they agreed on 3 important points. First, the leaders agreed that Wilson's idea about the League of Nations was a good one. The Versailles Peace Settlement, a document that both the winners and the losers of the Great War signed, formed this League of the Nations. Second, they agreed that Versailles Peace Settlement would rearrange the whole map. When World War I began, the large country of Austria, land that had once belonged to the Holy Roman Emperor of the Middle Ages, lay just east of Germany. Remember, Austria was also known as Austro-Hungarian Empire because the people in the eastern half of it had insisted that although they would pay allegiance to the Austrian Emperor, they wanted to have their own part of the empire to have its own name, Hungary, and its own separate constitution. Even though both countries were ruled by the emperor and the same army, the countries of Croatia and Bosnia lay within the borders of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Just south lay the independent countries of Serbia and Montenegro, and to the east, Bulgaria, with the Russian territory of Romania above it. Greece on the south of the peninsula and Albania just above it were independent countries. The Peace of Versailles changed almost all of this. First of all, Austria would be divided into two parts. From now on, this empire would be two separate countries, Austria to the west and Hungary to the east. A big slice of the land across the top was taken away and made into a brand new country called Czechoslovakia. On the bottom half of Austro-Hungarian Empire, Croatia and Bosnia were taken away from Austria-Hungary and put together with Serbia and made into yet another brand new country called Yugoslavia. So they took an independent country and shoved it with another country and thought that'll be okay. And then Montenegro was also folded into Yugoslavia. Only Albania and Greece got to keep their own land. Bulgaria, which had sided with Germany, would also be punished by losing some of its territory. Land in the western Bulgaria would be pulled into the new country of Yugoslavia as well. So this new country would have people from 5 different countries in it. And what about the Turkish Empire, which had also sided with Germany? The only part of the Turkish Empire left to the Turks was Asia Minor, the land that today we know as the modern nation of Turkey. France and Britain divided up the Turkish land south of Asia Minor. The land along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea went to France. Britain claimed the land north of the Arabian Peninsula and all the way over to the border of Persia. 10 years later, in 1929, Britain would divide part of this land that once belonged to the Turks off and name it Iraq. The empire of the Ottoman Turks, an empire that had governed in the east for centuries, was no more. It would become the Turkish Republic instead. Rearranging the whole eastern part of Europe was the second task of the Peace of Versailles. The third was the punishment of Germany. Germany had to give up huge amounts of its empire. The northern part of the empire was divided up. Some of the land went to Poland, which lay on Germany's eastern border between Germany and Russia. Some went to Russia itself. Other parts of Germany were given their freedom and became the independent nations of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Germany would lose all of its colonies. It could never have an army larger than 100,000 soldiers. Its navy could only have 6 battleships. Germany wasn't allowed to have any air force or submarine fleet, and most damaging of all, the Germans had to agree to sign a part of the treaty called Article 231, or the War Guilt Clause. This clause said, Germany accepted responsibility for all the loss and damages that the Allies suffered during the war, since the war was caused by Germany and her allies. This meant that Germany was solely responsible for the war and had to pay over $32 billion in losses and damages to other countries. The German representatives were furious over this clause. Germany too had suffered during the war. If Germany had to pay all of this money, the country would never be able to recover. And why was Germany being blamed for the entire war? when it actually started over the Balkan Peninsula. But the Allies refused to budge. Each one of the leaders had gotten what he wanted. Wilson of the US got his League of Nations. Clemenceau of France saw Germany punished. Lloyd George of Great Britain was happy because all of the new countries formed on the Peace of Versailles would act like a barrier between Great Britain and the communist Russia. Unfortunately, the Peace of Versailles led to a lot of trouble. When Woodrow Wilson returned home, he wasn't able to convince the United States Congress to join the League of Nations. Congress didn't want the United States to be involved with European politics. Instead, it thought that Americans should focus only on what was good for America. So the League, which had been thought up by an American president, went on without America. Most of the countries formed by the peace eventually fell apart. After all, their boundaries had been drawn by people who didn't live in them. Different groups of people who didn't share the same history or the same culture had been shoved together and told they were now citizens of the same country. In some of these new countries, people had hated each other for centuries, and now they were trapped inside the same borders. And the debt imposed on Germany made it poorer and poorer, and its people more and more miserable. In a few years, the German people would be ready to listen to anyone who offered to revenge the wrongs done to Germany, and who promised to make their country great again. So today, teacher is not going to give you an overview in Let Us Review. In fact, I'm going to give you half the overview in the interactive worksheets, and you're going to fill in the rest. Let's see how well you can let us review all by yourself.
That's off! I shouldn't have those artichoke poppers.